Okay, so that's clearly announced. Hello, everyone. I'm pleased to start our webinar session with you, and in the same time, welcome our guest speaker, Professor Fellbaum. This series of talks are conducted by Sheinman University lab, which is supervised by Mehnoush Shamsfar. I would ask her to introduce the lab and the talk series to us if it is your first time attending our webinars. To you, Mehnoush.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. Welcome to NLP Talk. The NLP Talk series is conducted by Natural Language Processing Lab of Sheinman University. This is the third NLP Talk webinar, and it's my honor to have Professor Christiane Fellbaum as our guest in this talk. We invite the famous and effective people in natural language processing and computational linguistic field to be our guest in each 1 or 1.5 months for a talk. And this is to spread the knowledge of natural language processing and computational linguistic for the audiences and let them to be more connected with this community. And I think for the first time, I met Professor Fellbaum in Mumbai, I think, in 2010, 11 years ago, in a Global WordNet conference, where she was the chair as ever, and I presented FarsNet, the Persian WordNet there. And in that conference and the following events, always her talk and her speech has been one of my favorite parts of the event. And today I'm also very interested and eager to listen to her talk. I actually thank you, Christiane, for accepting my invitation, and I'm very happy to have you in the third webinar of NLP Talk. Thank you, and we'll listen to introduction and brief bio of our guest by Esman, and then we'll listen to Christiane's speech. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mehnoush, and sorry for making you talk a long time, and we hope that you get well very soon. But that's very valuable that you didn't cancel the meeting even though you had the COVID positive test. I'm honored to introduce our guest speaker today, Professor Christiane Fellbaum. Christiane Fellbaum is a lecturer with rank of professor in the linguistic program at the computer science department at Princeton University, where she earned her PhD. Lexical semantics, syntax semantics interface, and computational linguistics. She's one of the developers of WordNet, a large lexical database that serves as a resource for computational linguistics and many natural language processing applications. She is a co-founder and co-president of Global WordNet Association, which guides the construction of electronic dictionaries in many languages. She was awarded the Wolfgang Paul Prize of Alexander von Humboldt Foundation in 2001 and Antonio Zampoli Prize from European Lexical Resource Association in 2006. She has lectured and taught in many countries around the world. Thank you very much, Christiane, and we are very excited to hear your talk.
All right. Well, thank you, both Mehnoush and Ehsan. It's a special pleasure to speak to this audience, even though it's only virtual. And I really sincerely hope we'll have a chance to meet for real in this life on either side of the ocean, the Atlantic. And in any case, continue being in contact by Zoom or by mail as much as possible. Today I will talk about scales in the lexicon, and I will report on work done by some colleagues of mine in collaboration with colleagues of mine and also with a number of students here at Princeton. I'm very interested in the topic, so probably like you, I try to get my students excited in this as well, and move research forward. So just a little bit of background. The lexicon of a language can be visualized as the large network with semantic relations like hyponymy, super-subordinate relation like vehicle and car, meronymy, the part-whole relation like car and wheel, and antonymy, large and small, linking words in like vertices in a network together. So this is a very simplified visualization of this. And those of you who have used WordNet or have looked at WordNet know that that's, again, a very simplified view, but that's WordNet is an implementation of this model of the lexicon of a language. Now, this model has been implemented in a number of different languages, almost 100 across the world. And it's found support in a number of other areas. So, example, child language acquisition, also language loss among people who get older and suffer from dementia. They lose words in very specific areas of the lexicon. The WordNet model is also supported by studies from lexical retrieval and word association. Neologisms, when we make new words, which we of course do all the time, we do them in such a way that they follow the patterns of a WordNet structure and again reflect these semantic relations. And more lately, there has also been evidence that from brain imaging that the associations are actually reflected in electrical activity in the brain and blood flow activity in the brain. But it's still an open question as to how many relations there really are and what kinds of semantic relations there are and what are these relations really like. So this is a long term pursuit. One of the parts of speech I want to look at today are adjectives. Adjectives, as many of you probably learned in the basic semantics class, come in different flavors or different kinds. One is gradable adjectives, which I will look at today, like big, expensive, and beautiful, and complementary adjectives like alive or pregnant or present. Complementary adjectives come in pairs, not in multiples. So either you are X or you are not X. You are X or Y. That would X and Y would be the pair of adjectives like dead and alive or present or absent. I know people sometimes say he's half alive or almost dead, but that's not scientifically correct. That's just the way we speak. And the language doesn't always have a word for one member of a complementary pair. So we have the word pregnant, but we actually don't have a word for unpregnant, which is also interesting because it clearly shows markedness or a default state of, in this case, the female body. The relation I want to look at today is intensity. So gradable adjectives, as I mentioned, come in multiples. Because they express different degrees of a given property. So this one semantic relation might be called intensity, and it links adjectives like large, huge, enormous, where intuitively enormous is more intense, larger, bigger than huge, which in turn is more intensive than large, or poor, destitute, and a bunch of other adjectives on that scale, as opposed again to complementary adjectives, which are not gradable and which I will not consider anymore today. Now, gradability or intensity comes in different areas of the lexicon. It comes in the adjective lexicon among dimensional or evaluative adjectives, dimensional such as large and small, evaluative such as say beautiful and ugly or expensive and cheap, where human judgment is particularly strong, and it also is found in emotion terms. So we love to different degrees. We like, we love, we venerate somebody, different strengths, different intensities. Or anger, we can be annoyed, we can be angry, we can be furious, right? Different strengths. So again, here are some examples. Dimensional adjectives such as size come in gradable variety, wealth, and emotion, nouns or verbs. So on the frightened scale of verbs, for example, we have scare, alarm, terrify, and so forth. So the challenge is, can we arrange such adjectives and such verbs on a scale according to their degree of intensity? Can we actually look at and show with some clear evidence, empirical evidence, that the scales exist and where the adjectives fall on such a scale? Now for gradable adjectives and emotion terms, the scales are open-ended. Speakers can always express more or less finer degrees with adverbs, even if we don't have words for them. So this is all from the corpus of contemporary American English. She must have been beyond beautiful. So the speaker didn't have a word for more beautiful. So he said beyond beautiful. Or we have a lot of enameled cast iron and they get extremely hot. So intensifying adverbs like extremely serve to indicate a degree that may not be lexicalized by a separate word. Here's another one, clever thinking, but still not what I call super smart. Here is, just to lighten things up, a picture from my German clothes dryer. Clothes dryers, of course, are intended to dry clothes. So the German word trocken, which is dry in German, is very important. And this German super engineered clothes dryer allows you to set many degrees of dry, of trocken. And the engineers had to find new words for dry, for trocken, to tell you how dry you want your laundry to be. So if you look on the left side, for example, you will see sehr trocken, very dry. Again, no word for that. Then below that, like 10 o'clock, it says schranktrocken, which in German means closet dry. Again, they invented a word. Then you have at 9 o'clock, you have leicht trocken, lightly dry. And then my favorite at the 7 o'clock position, bügeltrocken, which means ironing dry. So people are very inventive in making up gradable adjectives or verbs when the lexicon doesn't provide one. Manfred Bierwisch, a very, very wonderful German linguist, wrote an important paper in 1967 on the semantics of gradable adjectives. And he noticed, of course, that there are scales. They have two anchor points that form an antonymous pair, such as hot and cold, large and small, expensive, cheap, young and old. These adjectives have all kinds of interesting linguistic properties, which I won't go into today, and Bierwisch has written them up very clearly and nicely. But just one point that he noted was that of these two antonyms, one is always marked and one is unmarked. And you can find out which one is which by us looking at questions like how adjective is something. And then you always use the unmarked one. How big is something? How old is something? How heavy is something? And you only use the marked one. How small is something? How new is something? How light is something? In a specific context where it was already noted that something is small or cheap or narrow. Mm-hmm. But in a neutral context, you will always use the unmarked one. So he made this interesting observation about the fact that on the scale, the two look the same, but in actual language use, one is marked, special, specific, context constrained, and the other one is neutral or unmarked. So languages universally, and this is a challenge for everybody who's speaking languages other than the garden variety English languages like English and French and German. So I don't know about Persian, but I hope it's true as well. Languages encode points along the scale, and these two salient points form antonymic pairs. Again, here's an example of a scale, intuitive scale, going from Arctic to boiling, but of course open-ended as indicated by the dots, the two salient pairs being cold and hot. This particular scale is unusual because it has a center point lukewarm. Most scales don't have a middle point, but fall neatly into two parts. So such as a scale below, where the rich scale, you have more rich, more or less rich, less on the left side and more rich on the right side, and the other half of the scale, the poor side. Now, Larry Horn observed that there is an entailment relation among such gradable adjectives, unilateral entailment in one direction only, such that the stronger adjective entails the weaker one. And it is necessarily true that a gigantic car is a big car, gigantic being more intensive than big, but it is not true that a big car is necessarily a gigantic car. So the entailment holds logically in one direction only. Now, how do you determine scalemates? Well, first of all, again, as Birwisch already observed, scalar adjectives express specific values of a shared attribute, which can be expressed by a noun. So adjectives like large, huge, gigantic are values of the shared attribute size. But our questions, some of the questions I want to look at today, are which adjectives are scalemates or not scalemates? And where on their respective scales are they located relative to one another? What is the semantic distance, so to speak, among them? Is it constant, or are some adjectives really far apart? Is the degree of intensity not constant? And why do some speakers sometimes disagree on whether an entity, such as water or soup or weather, is cool or chilly or cold? Can we take this as evidence that these three are synonyms, for example? Representing scales would be very useful for several applications, and I will mention some of those later on in my talk, including automatic reasoning and inferencing, sentiment analysis, bias detection, product and service reviews. Much work in sentiment analysis labels only 2 or 3 points, and one of the motivations for looking at adjectives in terms of their scalar properties is to arrive at a more subtle sentiment analysis. And moreover, much of the current work on sentiment analysis is based on intuition or human judgments of specific lexical items and is not empirically derived. Again, coming to the question of universality, scales and bipolar adjectives may be universal or nearly universal. Again, it's an open question, but one that should be pursued. But we also found in our work with French, with my French colleague Yannick Mathieu, that the points along the scale do not necessarily line up across languages. And that's not really surprising, but it again needs to be shown empirically. Different languages lexicalize different intensities of gradable adjectives. So let's come to the question of ordering on the scales. Speakers have intuitions about orderings, and speakers will agree that adjectives are more or less intense, but can this be empirically verified? And corpus data turn out to provide insights. So we know intuitively that certain adjectives are scale members. For example, if you ask a question, is she smart? We can give answers like she's clever, she's intelligent, she's brainy, she's bright, she's brilliant. But we will not say she's tall, she's friendly, she's young, unless we want to evade the question whether she is smart. So this tells us that the first set of adjectives are likely to be scalemates, and the second one do not belong on the set of the smart scale. So how can we construct scales? If not scales, can we construct robust partial orderings at least? Are there loops? is the scale not always linear? So I already mentioned Larry Horn, who noticed the entailment among scalar adjectives, unilateral entailment. He also pointed out that there are lexical semantic patterns, small phrases, that identify stronger and weaker members of a pair at either side of such a phrase. So he focused on even, and he pointed out that in any phrase such as X even Y, where X and Y are adjectives, Y is a stronger, more intense member adjective than X. Conversely, the weaker one is not X, not Y, but X, like not brilliant, but smart, right? Or if not Y, then at least X. So these little snippets very clearly identify weaker and stronger members of a scale. Then Vera Sheinman came along. Vera wrote a thesis in Tokyo, in Japan, actually, where she said, I want to investigate this further with the ultimate goal of teaching, more efficiently teaching people English and the particular meanings, specific meanings of gradable adjectives. So she applied this method of patterns to a corpus, and she induced additional patterns. So she mined text for snippets with adjective scalemates. She took words from WordNet's dumbbells, which I'll show you again in a minute, such as large and gigantic, and separated them with a wildcard, here indicated by a star, and looked at a corpus and discovered what kind of patterns were substituted or showed up in the place of the wildcard. So just to remind you again, if those of you who don't know WordNet, I think some of you may know it. It has this dumbbell structure where you have the scale, the polar antonyms like large and small, and then you get a bunch of other adjectives at each end of what could be a scale and what hopefully will become a scale, but right now is some kind of dumbbell or satellite image. So she took adjectives like, let's say, small and tiny on the left there, and searched a corpus for snippets, text snippets in which these would occur in a lexical semantic pattern. So she induced a bunch of these. Here's one example. So great, even, fantastic, great, if not fantastic, great, but not fantastic. Some of these had been identified by Larry Horn already, but Vera found additional ones. Both what patterns where the more intense is on the right and those where it's on the left. She separated them into mild patterns and intense patterns, but again, it's really a scale, right? These snippets could then be used. This she had identified, like but not, and applied again to a corpus with all the other adjectives plugged in from, again, the WordNet dumbbell. Notice again that predictably you get many hits for something like good but not great, but you got no hits or virtually no hits for great but not good, right? Because that would be violating the symmetry between great and good, great being more intense than good. So this searches yield these pairwise asymmetries. And the pairwise asymmetries allowed Vera to construct partial orderings and scales or subscales of, in this case, emotion adjectives, going from cheerful to joyous to elated to euphoric. And one can compare these scales to human judgments, which we did, and I mention those later again. You also get some false positive. So one student of mine identified those and refined the regular expressions, the search patterns that one can apply to a corpus to exclude those. So false positives are ones where the same adjectives occur on either side, such as, alas, the fish was strong, but not strong enough, or enough, is the troublemaker here. So you get strong twice, or microwave till it's hot, but not so hot. Where again, hot occurs twice and doesn't give you any information about scalar relations. My student also found that many times, or often, these patterns turns up adjectives that belong to different scales. So such as he wore a three-piece suit that was expensive, but not flashy. Clearly expensive and flashy belong to different scales, yet they co-occur in this pattern. So these are very interesting cases, which again, one should investigate further because they reflect certain expectations of speakers with regard to which property of something entails another property. Not another degree here, but another property. So that's a whole area of research one could pursue, in particular when one looks at sentiment analysis, product reviews, and so forth. Vera and I and a student of mine, Isaac Julian, modeled how one would represent the scales in WordNet while maintaining the traditional WordNet dumbbell structure. And it would look something like this, where on the top you have the dumbbell structure, and at the bottom you have a scale derived as I described it, and linking the adjective in the dumbbell to their points on a scale. We haven't actually implemented that. It's still a model, but we hope to do so on a large scale soon. Now let me turn to scales in the emotion lexicon. Emotions are gradable, as I already mentioned. So we can like something or someone, we can love that person, we can adore that person most strongly. Conversely, we can dislike something, but we can hate something or detest or loathe something, right? Different degrees of a same emotion. So together with a French colleague, Yannick Mathieu, we examined verbs expressing the causation of three emotions. We took three, what we took as to be central emotions, and also emotions that are linked to different verbs, namely surprise, fear, and anger. We did it both for French and for English, but I'm only going to talk about English here today. We used Vera Sheinman's method, and going back to Larry Horn, applying these lexical semantic patterns to corpora. We compiled a manual list of verbs belonging to these three emotions, so surprise verbs, frighten verbs, annoy verbs, both for English and for French, and applied the patterns, for example, these three patterns that you can see here, to French and to English corpora. And the hits turned out the asymmetries that we predicted and that we were looking for. There's a stronger verb on the right, so annoy, even infuriate, infuriate being stronger than annoy. Anger, not to say incense, incense being stronger than anger. Or the other way around, the asymmetry going from the stronger to the weaker one. If not terrify, then scare. So it worked very nicely as we were hoping, but as you all know, one always has to try things out on real data. It worked as we expected. Again, for each verb pair in a given class, all patterns were applied. So we applied every combination in both directions, in both positions of a given pattern. And we also used all inflected verb forms, so as not to miss any useful hits. The most frequent pattern was the one that Larry Horn had originally noticed in 1972, the one with even, X, even, Y. Of course, even is a frequent word, has many different meanings and usages, so it's not surprising that that is the most frequent one. It's also the shortest way to express an asymmetry. Interestingly, most tokens that we found were adjectival past participles, like frightened, surprised. And again, going back to the adjectival flavor of these particular parts of speech. And harking back to the original work on the scales with adjectives. So its properties that really take on mostly are found in this gradability or intensity relation. We had between hundreds and dozens of hits, depending, of course, on the frequency of the individual lexical items. Yannick, Mathieu, and I cleaned them up manually, and almost all pairs showed a nice asymmetry. Sometimes we found verbs that seemed to have the same intensity, where we thought, well, this might be synonyms, or possibly they might really belong to a different scale. So I want to show you some things that didn't work, because so far I've said it always worked nicely, but there are always some puzzles. The lexicon is, of course, not as neat and as clean as we would like it to be, or as we would like to present in our work and our research. So we found things like the second sentence here. I'm still dealing with some level of doubt and fear. The assignment intimidates and even scares me. But we also found alarmed and scare, and alarmed and frightened. So that seems to suggest a scale. But in fact, I will come in a moment to the fact that it's not a really clean scale. So we did, the good news is we could construct a scale. We constructed a scale for surprise, intimidate, scare, frighten, alarm, terrify. I'm sorry, that's for fear. For surprise, the scale goes from astonish to stupefy. And of course, remember they're potentially open-ended. So you could modify them by saying almost or extremely, and extend the intensity by modifying the verb or the adjective. And the annoy scale is given below. Now here is a case I mentioned earlier where things don't work out so neatly. So we found for the pair alarm and intimidate, we found it in both kinds of patterns. And so this suggests that either they are synonyms, or as we came to conclude later, that intimidate perhaps doesn't belong to this scale. So this kind of misfit points to further research. But overall, if you exclude the reddened examples, everything worked nicely, because you can see that every pair, you can see the asymmetry, like in alarm and frightened. It works in one kind of pattern where the first one is stronger than the second, and you do not get hits for the second kind of pattern, which would indicate that alarm is weaker than frightened. So the overall picture is very nice and very neat. But as I said, there are some puzzles. So again, intimidate and scare seem to show up in both patterns, indicating a lack of asymmetry. Another way to investigate the asymmetry, or to the question as to whether something really belongs into a scale, looking at lists. If we make a list then of a property that we denote, we associate with something or somebody, we tend to list adjectives from different scales, not from the same scale. So if you look at the bottom, where I have the corpus example, if someone else's behavior makes you feel alarmed, intimidated, embarrassed, or annoyed, these should really be 4 different kinds of adjectives, but intimidate and alarm show up together, indicating that indeed they are not, as we pre-classified them, members of the same scale. Right? So the same thing happened when I asked students with human validations, and I asked students for pairwise orderings of adjectives and the emotion adjectives, and I also asked them to arrange them on a scale. Students were not given any patterns. I just asked them to rely on their intuition. They found this very hard, by the way, and they really scratched their heads and said, this is a really difficult task. So again, overall, there was pretty good agreement among the speakers themselves, and also between the speakers and the corpus data. But again, intimidate was not classified cleanly, indicating that it doesn't belong to the frightened scale. So I just want to highlight the fact that there's always something that doesn't fit and that overrides your initial intuition or pre-classification. But overall, the method worked rather well. Here's the human validation for anger verbs. You can see the different verbs arranged in the way we had classified them. And you can see that where humans put them in terms of the strengths, 1 through 9. And 1 being the weakest in this case, and 9 being the strongest. And I highlighted the more or less diagonal here, which are the most ratings for a given intensity for a given verb. So it's reasonably neat, not perfect, as always with human language data, but reasonable. Same with surprise, a little messier here, but again, you can see some kind of diagonal. And frighten worked rather well. Intimidate, which we decided doesn't really belong here, is the weakest, but the other 4 verbs line up very nicely in that most speakers rated terrify as the most intense, and frighten as the next less intense, scare as the next less intense, and alarm more or less the same as scare. Of course, there are limitations to this method. As I already pointed out, there's always some noise in the data. If you search corpus, frequency is of course important and influences your results. So some verbs are very frequent, others are less frequent. Verbs like surprise are extremely frequent. Verbs like flabbergast, which is a kind of surprise, is less frequent. And that influences not only your numerical results, but also human data. Because as we know from much of psycholinguistics, less frequent verbs come to mind less frequently and have a less strong and robust mental representation in speakers' minds as well. I will not say much about the French-English translation here work, but I will only say that we found, not surprisingly, that the number of verbs differs across French and English, and surely will do so across other languages. And the given translations, given meaning that you look them up in a dictionary or in Google Translate or whatever, don't always share the same neighbors locally on a scale, which indicates that they really are not very good translation equivalents. Okay, now I would like to turn my attention to emojis. So again, I worked with a student at Princeton, Pulkit Singh, who wrote a senior independent work thesis on this. And then we made it into a paper at some additional work also involving Yannick Mathieu, my French colleague. So emojis, as we all know, of course, have some properties of words and some that are different from verbs. So they're like words, they're discrete. Each one is a unit. And they are what lexicographers call a form meaning mapping. Particular emoji, presumably, communicates a specific meaning. And speakers who use them share the understanding of the meanings associated with specific emojis. Emojis are nice because they are universal code and language independent. And of course, they are nonverbal expressions and can serve to augment verbal communication. They're increasing in popularity. People constantly add new ones. The last time I looked, there were 1,600 of them. Many, but not all, express emotions. Originally, of course, they were intended to express emotions, hence their name, emojis. And the growing number of emojis, of course, allows for subtle, ever subtle differentiation of meaning or of sentiment, which, as I argued earlier, is less easy with language, as we saw with the German clothes dryer and with the study, again, done by a student of mine, with intensifying adverbs like very or terribly or really. The repetition of a given emoji is also a possibility that we don't use with language, which indicates the intensity of a given sentiment. So again, with language, we have to use an intensifier. Otherwise, it sounds odd if we just repeat a certain word. But with emojis, that's commonly done. So the question was, can we map emojis to English words, identify scales, and if so, are these scales consistent with human judgments? So as I mentioned, Pulkit Singh, my student under my supervision, wrote a senior thesis, and then we built on this for a paper. Pulkit Singh asked about 30 speakers via Amazon Mechanical Turk. 3 tasks, gave them 3 tasks. One was to rate the intensity of specific emojis on a 1 to 5 scale. Make pairwise comparisons of emojis. So this is very much like one of these patterns, which one is more or less intense. And finally, to match the emojis to English emotion words, adjectives in this case. Here's an overview of the task that Singh posed to the students, to the Turkers. First, emoji rating, which how angry is this emoji in this case between 1 and 5. Then pairwise comparisons, and finally, which adjective, which word maps into which emoji. Again, here's a larger view of the tasks. First one, how angry is this emoji, 1 to 5. Again, you can see that among the people who rated these, the results were pretty consistent. On the left, you can see there really is a linear increase in intensity, and the same is reflected in the heat map on the right. Second task was the pairwise emoji ordering, very parallel to the pattern searches that were done with words and patterns such as even or if not then. And again, all adjectives were used in all combinations. And finally, we could derive scales from the responses. Which one is more angry? Gave half of the scale, and which one is less angry? The scale below that. Same for fear, and the bottom half of the slide. Then another set of respondents of Turkers, 50 in this case, were asked to match a word to a single emoji, as in the example here. Which emoji do you most associate with the word infuriated? And again, the word emoji mappings for the most frequent responses allowed or supported the construction of scales. Here is a scale for anger, ranging from irked to enraged, and the corresponding emojis. However, notice that despite the many emojis that we have, the 3 emojis on the left all map to the same, the same emoji maps to 3 different words, right? So there is much less distinction in this case for the emojis than there is on the verbal scale. Here is the fear scale. Again, notice that there is a lot of overlap with the emojis. So the emoji selection here was rather boring or not very varied. We also collected human judgments just for the words without the emojis. And Singh reproduced this with her Turkers. And we found a very high agreement, in fact, complete agreement, which made us very happy, both given here for the anger scale and for the fear scale. So verbally, the humans agreed with the emotions. There was a little less differentiated than we had hoped for. Okay, I would like, time is running out. I would like to talk about some applications now. So information on scalar properties of words, adjectives, and verbs, or adjectival past participles, as we've seen, in lexical resources can be exploited by automatic systems. So one great potential is for automatic reasoning or inferencing, again, building on the unilateral entailment of the stronger to the weaker member of a scale that Horn noticed in 1972. There is a task, maybe some of you have participated in this, a standard task in the NLP community that goes back to a government, US government initiative that is very interested for various reasons in automatic text understanding on a subtle level. So going beyond just word matching or syntactic matching, like from active to passive, but really seeing what the text contains in terms of meaning that a human can extract that is not explicitly represented on the surface. Can we teach machines to reproduce or learn this human, subtle, deep text understanding? So the standard task, a standard task that is presented to the community and people compete to get good results is the following. You are given a text T and a hypothesis H, and your system is given both T and H and asked to evaluate in a binary manner whether the hypothesis H is true or follows logically, is implied in that text from T, from the given text. Now, if you have an example like the one I've given here, which is a real example, frigid weather sweeps across New Jersey, and the hypothesis is the garden state experiences cold temperatures, then the adjective scalar implicature should tell you that the hypothesis is true and could classify it as true because frigid is more intense than cold and thus entails cold. Anything that's frigid is also cold. Therefore, based on the adjectives, the hypothesis is true. Now, of course, we do a bunch of other things which are not relevant to my talk here when we perform this task. For example, we match synonyms, or we see whether synonyms can be matched. So those of you who are not Americans might not know that New Jersey, the state of New Jersey, has the nickname the Garden State. So these are synonyms, and your system, of course, also uses such relations. But as far as the scalar implicature is concerned, frigid and cold, what we have learned about adjective scales supports and can be very useful and helpful in this task. And notice, of course, again, that reversing the text and the hypothesis would not support, or the adjectives in these two sentences would not support the hypothesis. So it's unilateral. Another kind of application of scales that was explored again by a student of mine, Miriam Stern, in junior independent research she did under my supervision at Princeton University this past semester. She looked at pain scales. So in the medical, she's going to be a doctor. In the medical field, when doctors assess patients and try to find a diagnosis and, of course, ultimately a possible treatment, they ask patients to describe their pain. Sometimes they ask them, typically, in fact, on a scale from 1 to 10, and that is very difficult for patients to do. But a slightly better system goes back to the McGill Pain Questionnaire, or MPQ, that uses 78 adjectives and in 20 different categories. And each category has between 2 and 6 words. And Miriam asked whether a consistent intensity ordering of the adjectives in each group can be derived from corpus mining data from patients that they posted online, and speaking specifically about their pain. So Miriam mined chronic pain discussions, a forum for patients with different kinds of symptoms, 3 different kinds of symptoms, but all patients suffering from serious and chronic pain. She mined these data for adjectives and again applied the lexical semantic patterns. So she found hits like no hurting or prickling feelings, just the numb tingling feeling. Notice the adjectives, hurting, prickling, numb, tingling. And the pattern no, just, right, which is again the just introduces a scale here. The just is weaker than the adjectives to the left, presumably. And the example below, often I start getting the pinching and even shooting pain, even again our favorite strong pattern for strength symmetry, pinching and shooting again being judged as shooting being stronger than pinching by this particular writer. So Miriam came up with these small but interesting and important scales within each pain category suggested by the McGill pain questionnaire. The categories don't really matter. The numbers are just random in this case. They're real numbers, but you can see that there are different categories, and within each category, Miriam derived the scale given on the right: stabbing, prickling, burning, hot, the intensive one always being on the left in this case, tingling, itching. Then in the next one, again noting synonyms: dull, sore, aching, right? And so forth. So these are small scales because the group members given by this pre-classified in the MPQ categories were rather small. So it's not surprising that the reliable ratings are relatively small. Finally, I want to quickly say something about applications of scale in product and service reviews. So again, harking back to sentiment analysis, where the idea is to map the language of review texts, in particular adjectives, but also verbs, with the global rating, either a single word or a star rating, in a more subtle way. And so to look at not just saying this is great, 5 stars, or this is pretty good, 4 stars, but really look a little more specifically as to what the reviewer has to say if there is a text review going along with the star review. And going beyond that, refining the reviews by specific aspects of a product or a service in order to decompose the global ratings into, again, finer reading, more fine-grained reading of the review. So my first student who did this way back when worked on hotel reviews. This was Alice Fuller in, I believe, 2013. We looked at hotel reviews. She's now actually working for a hotel booking company online and hope she's using the data. But she found that, again, using data mining of the text, that users or people who stayed in hotels rated different aspects of hotel room differently with different adjectives and different degrees. And the composite review should be read very carefully by people who have hotels or manage hotels, because she found that things like equipment, microwave oven or refrigerator, are not important, but service in the hotel room or in a hotel is the most important rating and correlates most strongly with the overall global rating of the hotel. I also did work with another French colleague, Cédric Lopez, and on perfume. Of course, it was French work, so we had to look at French perfume. And we looked at ratings of 48 perfumes, and we looked at specific aspects of the perfume product: the smell, the persistence, how long the perfume lasts on a person's body, the packaging, and the price. And again, we derived scales for each of these aspects of the perfume product and correlated that with the overall rating of the perfume, and found a difference between the way people rated these different aspects and weighted them in terms of how they rated the overall product. So again, perfume makers, watch out what you're doing and how you are working on the individual aspects of your product. Okay, I think time is up, and I want to thank you for your attention and ask you if you have any questions. Just in case, I think we have half an hour for questions, but just in case there are more questions or people want to talk more privately about what I've said and discuss it in more detail, please feel free to email me. I think my email is available, and I'm very happy to enter in discussion with you, and maybe if you're interested in future work or future ideas to apply this work, I'd love to hear about that, or maybe you have done similar work. So feel free to contact me. Okay, that's all I want to say for now, and please ask questions.
Yes, thank you very much. We have one question coming. How do you want to manage it, Christiane? Do you want me
well,
to read
let's
it,
see.
or?
If I stop share, do I see the person, or what do I do? I see a Q&A. Let's see. Let me go to the. I don't really see the Q&A. I guess I can stop share. I stop share, right? Do I stop share?
Doesn't necessarily need to stop share, because if you want to refer to one of your slides, might be easier.
Yeah, might be easier. I don't see on my screen the Q&A. So maybe you can read it, or the person who has the question can ask yes. themselves. Can we do it that way?
One question so far. What is your opinion about the effects of polysemous words or figurative use of words? Example, metaphorical uses in interpreting scales.
Okay. I think that's super interesting. I never thought about the metaphorical use. Thank you for asking that. I say a little bit more just off the top of my head in a minute, but let me say something about polysemy first. Polysemy, of course, if an adjective or a verb is polysemous, you would find it in the same patterns, but with different adjectives. And this would be a hint that it also belongs on a different scale, right? So it could mean two things. It could either mean what I said earlier, that there is some expectation. I think I had good, cheap but good, or something like that, right? So where somebody expects cheap things to be bad. It could also mean that given adjectives actually belongs on more than one scale, and that is something we haven't really looked at, but I think that's super interesting. Same with metaphor. So it would again be very, very interesting to see whether a metaphor is a kind of polysemy, of course, when adjective has a metaphorical meaning that belongs on a different scale from its arguably literal meaning, whether that a metaphoric use also has scale mates in that other domain. So that would be interesting and something to explore. In other words, whether it's not just one adjective that is metaphorized or that is transported into a different scale, but other scale mates from the original literal scale are also being transported into the extended use, and if so, which ones? So I think that would be super interesting to explore. Okay. Any other questions?
Manush, are you okay?
Manush, I hope you're feeling all right. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks to pills, I'm okay. I have a question too. I was checking WordNet to see the difference in the definitions of the adjectives or adverbs with different intensity. And I saw that most of them are synonyms. For example, we have similar synonymity between brilliant and smart, between brilliant and bright, and as you separated them by the grades. So I wanted to ask if your research can be useful to do reverse dictionary finding. I mean that to find reverse dictionaries to find the word according to its definition. It seems that as they have very similar definitions or the same, we cannot do it. Am I correct?
Yes, yes. And let me add, as I think you know, WordNet was built a long time ago, started a long time ago, and without the benefit of corpora. So basically relying on the intuition of lexicographers. And the person who did the adjective did their best, but didn't have these tools available and these methods we were talking about. So they intuitively grouped brilliant and smart together, which we might not today, given the data. But yeah, I agree. I think it would be very interesting to look at the definitions, and you said, I think, reverse engineer adjectives that belong together on a scale, and then, but then also ultimately, I guess, implement this and build a lexical resource where they are in different places on a scale or whatever, in different entries, and also with different definitions, right? Because the definitions.
Do we have newer resource, for example, the Global WordNet, that be different in this sense and have different definitions?
As far as I know, and I'm not up on the latest, I haven't really worked on WordNet for a while now. People have not taken this up, these scalabilities. I know Roberto Navili, who I think was one of your speakers, and I haven't had the chance to look at his talk yet, but I think he talked a lot about definitions. So maybe he has some idea about generating definitions, and conversely, looking at definitions to arrive at a more fine-grained sense distinction. I think that's a great way to explore, a great direction to explore. But I don't know of any specific work there. And WordNet, as I said, unfortunately, just basically for lack of funding, hasn't been worked on and hasn't really done much actual implementation. We've thought about this theoretically, but haven't implemented that. That's always a lot of work.
Actually, I'm thinking about newer technologies using for lexical semantics, such as making vectors, embeddings, and doing works in distributional semantics. And as I refer to my mind, I remember about what we have done in this way. I think that the vectors of these scaled adjectives or adverbs are very near to each other, and we cannot find any ordering in the with the comparison of the vectors. And so maybe the new technologies cannot be used for ordering these scales, and we have to find something else.
Yeah. Yes, I think that's very well put, and I think embeddings are wonderful, and that's a wonderful technique and tool for exploring word meanings and similarities or differences among words. But I think they need to be considered in complementation and complement to traditional methods. And as you were saying, this is one way where they don't seem to be differentiated. However, if you look at the co-occurrence, the distribution of stronger adjectives very locally in a corpus, you would find that the vector for even plus an adjective on the right should be different for another adjective, the weaker one, even on the same scale, and that adjective on the right. So they should, if you look at it very targeted in a very local context and looking for specific co-occurrences, the vector or the embedding semantics should also give you some reflection of at least of the intensities, right? But not as efficiently, of course, as mining a corpus, specifically using this data and looking in a very targeted way, right?
That's true.
And but you
the
would,
last question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry.
No,
sorry.
I was just going to say something I already said. So go ahead.
I wanted to ask another question. That is it possible that the ordering of these scales be dependent on the context or corpus or the domain? I cannot find any example. Just asking if you have find anything. That, for example, in one domain, the ordering is different with another domain.
Yes. I think that's absolutely true. That may very well be true. And again, that may build on your expectation of what properties you find to associate with a given entity, right? I think that's a very good intuition. And again, we haven't looked at that. We tried to look at a broad corpus. Either in most cases, we looked at the web. So Vera Sheinman used the web. Yannick Mathieu and I used the web, was in French and in English. But I've also used the corpus of contemporary American. And we have not really separated this by genre or by context. Yeah, I think that's certainly the weakest statement. That's I would hypothesis would be that the range of adjectives is smaller given a domain, right? So you just have fewer adjectives, just as we saw, for example, with the pain descriptors, right? They were very specific, and there were relatively few adjectives in each category. And we also know, of course, that frequency of an adjective, of a form, is correlated with it's the number of senses it has, and therefore follows also with the number of contexts in which it is used, or the number of nouns it modifies. So many things can be cold and hot, right? These are the most frequent salient polar adjectives, but not so many things could be frigid or arctic, right? So we would say the weather is frigid or arctic, but and we would say the water is frigid but not arctic, but we wouldn't say the soup is frigid or arctic, right? So there are definitely usages, and as you say, they may actually line up differently or reflect different scales, intensities that the speaker wants to convey. So I think that's super interesting. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Ehsan, we have another question. The question answer. Will you please read it?
Yes, we have one more question, and
Okay.
also the questioner, she can open her microphone and ask or clarify. I will read the question. I think if we think of speech, in the intonation can help to tag incentive adjectives. I mean, suprasegmental features have potential to search on in this field.
Okay. Okay. Interesting. Yeah. I personally stay away from speech because it's so difficult. And I admire people who work on speech. Yes. So one thing that comes to mind, and maybe whoever's asking this question, great question, may have this in mind too, goes back when I talked about the marked and unmarked, right? So Bierwisch observed that you say how old it is, how old is your car, but you don't say how new is your car, right? Old being the unmarked part of the scale, polar antonym, nu being the other one. And you would only say how new is your car if you already said, I bought a new car, I have a new car, right? And then I think the intonation is different, because you would say, how new is your car, right? Because new is an adjective that's been previously introduced. Whereas if you say, how old is your car, doesn't necessarily mean you already said that your car is old, right? If you just bring your car to the dealer and he would say, how old is your car? He wouldn't say, how new is your car, right? So their intonation is either on the adjective, if it's unmarked, right? Or on the how, if it is the marked case. So, yeah. I don't see who asked this question, but did that person have an example in mind with the intonation?
Cool. If you want to add anything.
Okay. Yes,
Yeah, Shoku, I can see you. Please, yeah, please ask.
You're muted, Shuku, if you're talking.
Yeah, unmute yourself. Can you send her a...
Okay. Hello, everyone. Can you hear me now?
Yes, great. Hi,
Yes.
Shaku.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Hi. Hello. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to talk. These days, I'm working on speech recognition systems. I'm thinking about them, and I think intonation is really important. In this field, and I think it's really interesting. For example, when I have a headache, I would say show the intensity of the pain by my intonation. For example, I say I have a headache, or I have a headache, something like that. So I think intonation is really important. And help speech recognition systems to define, by a speech recognition system, I mean, for example, when these systems are turning speech to text, they can show the intensity of an adjective if they could recognize the intonation. I mean, this how I could tell what I'm thinking about.
Yeah, no, I know exactly what you mean. Yeah, I think that's super interesting. Yeah. And people, of course, do this in texting all the time, right? They say, what, with many A's, right? Or something like that. And your headache example is beautiful.
Yes.
Yeah. So that's a great example. Yeah. So if one could somehow relate that to a measurable way of intensity, that would be great. So intuitively it expresses intensity, but can this be quantified empirically? Yeah. I don't have any ideas here, but maybe you do. But I think that's super interesting. Yeah. Okay. Are you working in Manush's group?
I'm just reading about it. I'm increasing my information.
Okay.
I have found some researchers in this field, but all of most of them are text-based rather than speech. I have not focused
Yes, that's
on the speech.
Yeah.
How
So
people, deliver their pain in their speech.
Yeah, I think that's a super interesting field. So yeah, so maybe you can tell me a little more offline, or think about what you've done or what. Yeah. Okay. As I said, most people, certainly I work on text because speech is so difficult, but it's at the same time, this is a great challenge and a really, really interesting problem. So I hope you can make some progress, have some ideas. Yeah, that's very cool. Thank you.
Thank you very much for giving me
this.
Express my opinion.
We have a similar experience in what you talked about. We had a project on emotion analysis in social networks, and we replaced the repeated letters in the text to a degree which showed the intensity of what the user was written or has written. And for example, if it says I am too sad with, for example, 8 A's, we replaced it with sad and an 8 in parentheses in front of it. And then we used the numbers to analyze the text to see what's the emotion and what's its degree in sadness or being eager or happiness or something else. It was somehow similar to what she asked.
Yeah, this is very cool.
I'm getting a lot of words like this. I'm gathering a lot of words in Persian like this. I'm searching on forums and gathering how people express their pain. I have an Excel on it, and but I have not done any scientific research on it. I'm just reading books, articles to increase my information. Thank you very much.
Yeah, well, Shaku, yeah, if you have any thoughts, be in touch. That's really super interesting. And what Manoush was saying, so maybe, I don't know how speech to text works, but if the written or text to speech, if the written many A's and sad, like say 8, also the number can correlate in a consistent way with the speech, the drawn out vowel, right? Is there a consistent translation, automatic translation? That would be, I don't know whether there is, but that would be a first step to look at. And then, as Manoush was saying, right, look at what you did. Look at the correlation with adjective in that speech. Yeah, Manoush, send me that paper if you have any, or that report. I'd love to see that. Yeah, that's very cool.
Okay.
And it's specifically for pain, or?
No, sorry.
Sorry for the interruption. Yes, I'm just searching about 10 and inspired by Lancaster University, who work on pain language. I just
you disappeared, Shaku, but your sound disappeared. But okay, I hope we talk more or be in touch. Yeah, okay. Great. Yeah, okay. Wonderful. Well, that's what these meetings are for, right? We learn about each other's works. Yeah.
Yeah, I thought we have another question. Would you please?
Yes, please.
Okay. In complementary adjectives, you said half alive is not scientific. Isn't it oversimplification to assume language should be scientific? Examples such as half alive don't question the assumption of considering a class of complementary adjectives. Why don't we consider them gradable as they are used unscientifically in the quotation?
Okay, yeah, thank you for that question. Yeah, I was a little sloppy or dismissive when I said not scientific. What I meant, I guess, was what a medical person would tell you, right? So death and life are complementary. A person is either alive or dead. And real people, either metaphorically, like after running a marathon, saying I'm half dead, or because they really are very, very ill, might say, my grandmother is only half alive, are more aware of maybe non-biological or what medical people use to classify. They're more aware of gradients there. So I didn't mean to be sort of dismissive in any sense, and I was being a little sloppy when I said non-scientific. Clearly, there is something that speakers differentiate, and that's we should respect and pay attention to. But it's interesting that there are no words for this, right? So we say half, we just modify one of the complementary ones. And in the case of dead and alive, we do this. We say half or barely or something like that. But notice in the case of pregnant, of course, it is really binary, right? We don't say she's a little bit pregnant. Or if we do say that, you can actually find this in the corpus. So you can find things like she's very pregnant. What we mean then is the physical appearance of pregnancy, the swollen belly, right? But the biological effect of there being life in somebody's body is binary, right? But yes, you're right. So thank you for calling me on the carpet for being a little bit sloppy here and dismissing it with saying it's not scientific. It's definitely interesting, and it reflects speakers' view of the world, right? Which is ultimately what we are interested in. Mm-hmm.
Okay, as there is no question, let me talk about one of our other related researchers about your work. It has some overlaps. A few years ago, we have done something on fuzzifying these adjectives for different entities. For example, when we say a small elephant, it's yet more larger than a big, for example, ant.
Yes.
And so now we created a fuzzified ontology and used the different adjectives for size, and I think size and amount and some adjectives, and then fuzzified them and use the moderated adjectives, for example, very little or something else for the size, for example, with adjectives like small, very small, extremely small, and this, and draw their fuzzy membership functions, and then would be able to understand and quantify the sentences like, for example, I put a small pen in my, for example, in the large box, or vice versa. I put a large pen in the small box and show which one can be imaginable. For example, if we could put a small elephant in a large box or in a large, for example, matchbox or not. And it was interesting. One of my MS students did it, and I think that its paper is in archive. We didn't publish it.
All right, I look for that. Okay. Yeah. Okay. That sounds very interesting. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Absolutely. So yeah, that's interesting. The work you did. This has been observed by, I think, Lauri Kartunen or somebody. Yeah, that a tiny elephant is still a lot bigger than a huge mouse, right? Yeah. And we scale our scales according to the entity that we modify. That's interesting. Yeah. But again, I would ask you the question that one of you asked, a listener asked, do you actually get a different ordering if you look at?
No.
You don't, I see. Okay, so that's an empirical question. And
just the membership functions would shrink or grow, but the ordering was not different.
Okay. So the membership functions, yeah, that's what I also mentioned earlier. I'm sure that's the case, yeah. But is the membership function, the size of the membership function of the scale mates, is that a function of the absolute size, so size of a mouse versus size of an elephant, or is it a question of maybe it's the same? Is it a question of the fact that certain adjectives, in particular the polar ones, take many more, modify many more nouns than the specialized ones?
We use the typical one in each category. For example, when we talked about a laptop and we saw it, a very heavy laptop, the typical laptop with, for example, I don't know what is now 1 to 3, for example, kilos. And so heavy laptop was about, for example, 2 or 3 kilos, not more. But with a heavy, for example, table, it was not 2 or 3 kilos. It was, for example, I don't know how many kilos.
200 pounds.
Yeah. So the membership functions was specific to a typical one of that type, and was drawn according to exact sizes. For example, how many centimeters, kilos, and meters.
Very interesting. Yeah, I see.
For some entities.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm just buying a new laptop, so I just looked this morning at the page, and now they, making lighter and lighter ones. And like my dryer, they don't have a word for it. So they say super light, extra light.
And these changes during the time. For example, a light laptop in 10 years ago was too heavier than the light laptop
Exactly.
today. So
right.
If we go this way, we have to change the ontology by time.
Yes, that's very true. Yeah, so that's exactly right. So the same company, Apple, advertises a new laptop, and they say, if you think the old MacBook Pro was light, this one is super light or super duper light. Or they have to. Yes, exactly. Right. Yeah.
Right.
So
okay, we have 4 more minutes, and then another question. Ehsan, would you please?
Yes, I think it will be the last question. How do you treat big and large? Are they quasi-synonyms, or do they belong to the same scale?
Okay, yes, very good question. So there are 4 words. We have big and large, and we also have small and little. And conceptually, they seem to be the same. They seem to be synonyms on the conceptual, on the meaning level. However, they have very different distributional properties. So if you, for example, if you go to and order something, you say a small portion or a large portion. You wouldn't say a big portion or a little portion. But other things, I don't know what's big and little. Anyway, so there is a very clear lineup of the members of the 2 pairs with a given set of entities that they modify, and there's very little overlap. Yes, so in terms of the scale, they would have to be synonyms, yes. But in terms of the actual data that you find, you will see that it falls out according to what it is they modify. And you would not find, or you do find, but not very often, you do find in your patterns, let's see, no, I guess the other scale mates are the same for each pair. So big and little really belong into the same scale. The central points are just different. But in terms of the relationship to the other members on the scale, they seem to be not differentiated. So it's just those core ones that are picky in their selectional restrictions.
Thank you very much. I think that was the last question, and we are sharp on time.
Okay, well, thank you. Yeah.
I want to thank you, you first, and also our colleagues here that help us to organize this webinar. Can you see my screen? And also thank you, Dr. Shamsfar, for helping us. This is the committee that runs the talks.
Okay.
And thank you all. Also, for 22nd of September, we will hosting Professor Bing Liu from University of Illinois at Chicago. So stay tuned, everyone that attended this webinar. We will send further updates for the next talk.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, thank you very, very much. And let me also say again this, I'm looking forward to Bing Liu, who of course worked on sentiment analysis a lot. So that should be really interesting. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a nice day.
Thank you.
Night.
Yeah, the day is just starting for me. You have a good night. Okay. All right. And I hope to stay in touch with my colleagues in Iran in particular. Yeah.
Sure. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Okay. And I also want to thank from Christiane for accepting my invitation and having a very interesting talk and answering the questions. I hope to be able to meet each other in present, so, yeah. Not online in the near future, without any COVID, without any quarantine, and without any mask. And we hope to be able to be back to our regular lives. And I hope to have more collaboration in the future.
Yes,
thank you again
I
for
would like
being
that,
with
Manoush.
us.
Yeah, I would like that. We need to make peace between us, if not the countries, at least between us. Be well. Okay. Goodbye, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
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 Thank you.
Goodbye, everybody.